Hey everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive.
Hmm.
This one is really gripping, feels like something you'd see in a movie, but it's all too real. We're talking about Jimmy Lai, the Hong Kong media tycoon. He's currently on trial, and it's for violating Hong Kong's national security law. What's really interesting to me about this deep dive is that we're using a bunch of different sources. We've got these news articles that just came out, like literally hot off the press. They're all about Lai's recent appearance in court. And then we're also using some background pieces that dig into his past, which honestly, it's pretty wild. The guy's led a fascinating life, to say the least.
Yeah, I mean, it's a story that kind of hits on some of the biggest issues in the world right now. We're talking freedom of the press, how China and the West are dealing with each other, and even what's going to happen to Hong Kong itself. It's all kind of wrapped up in this one man's story.
It's like all these global tensions, all these anxieties are playing out right there in the courtroom. And speaking of the man himself, Jimmy Lai, could you give us a little background for those who might not know him? Like, who is this guy beyond the headlines?
So picture this. You've got a guy who starts out in the clothing business. He builds it up from nothing, becomes incredibly successful, and then decides to become a media mogul. That's Jimmy Lai. He's the founder of Apple Daily, a newspaper that was, well, it was huge in Hong Kong. And it was known for, let's just say, not holding back. They were pro-democracy, totally outspoken, and they were not afraid to criticize the Chinese government.
So we're not talking about some polite disagreement here. This was straight up confrontation. What exactly was Lai criticizing about the Chinese government? What were his main issues?
He was really concerned about China's policies towards Hong Kong, especially when it came to like Hong Kong's autonomy. He truly believed that Beijing was basically stepping on the freedoms that Hong Kong was supposed to have
Hmm.
under this framework called One Country, Two Systems. This was set up when Hong Kong went back to China in 1997. It was supposed to guarantee Hong Kong could keep its own systems, like its own legal system and government, for 50 years. But Lai was worried they weren't honoring that.
Right. And it wasn't just about politics for him,
Yeah.
right? I mean, I read that his personal beliefs played a huge role in shaping his views, especially his Catholic faith and what he went through during the Tiananmen Square protest back in 1989. Like, that must have had a profound impact on him.
Absolutely. Those experiences were they were defining moments for him. Seeing the crackdown in Tiananmen Square firsthand, that was brutal. It really shook him. And it solidified his commitment to, well, to democracy and freedom of information. He felt like he had to use his platform, his newspaper, to fight for those values, particularly in Hong Kong.
It's like he saw what happened in Tiananmen Square and thought, that can't happen here, not in Hong Kong. So now he's on trial. Can you break down the charges against him? What's he actually accused of?
The charges are pretty serious. He's facing 2 counts of colluding with foreign forces and 1 count of sedition. And all of this comes from Hong Kong's national security law, which was implemented in 2020. And let me tell you, it's been a source of huge controversy ever since.
Oh, yeah. This law has been incredibly controversial. Why is that? What sparked so much debate and criticism, even internationally?
Well, a lot of people see this law as a direct threat to the freedoms that Hong Kong was promised, that one country, two systems thing we talked about. Critics say it's way too broad, the definitions are vague, and it could basically be used to shut down anyone who disagrees with the Chinese government.
So this trial is happening in this really, really tense context. You've got political tensions, anxieties about freedom shrinking, and then on top of all that, this recent court appearance was the first time Lai has spoken publicly since his arrest almost 4 years ago.
It was quite the scene. The courtroom was packed. Lai's family, Cardinal Zen, who's a very prominent figure in Hong Kong, very close to Lai, supporters. It's definitely a case that's got everyone watching.
They said he looked thinner, but he still smiled and waved to people in the gallery. Do we know anything about what he actually said during this court appearance?
Well, according to the reports, Lai denied advocating for Hong Kong's independence. He also said that he was against violence during those 2019 protests. It seems like his argument is that he was just exercising his right to free speech, advocating for democracy. It's really interesting to see how he's thinking and what his defense strategy is.
So he's pushing back against these accusations, defending his actions. It almost sounds like this trial is about more than just one man. Like it's a test of what free speech even means in Hong Kong these days.
Exactly. And we can't forget about what happened to Apple Daily back in 2021. Lai's own newspaper, it got shut down under the same national security law. That was a huge blow, not just for Lai, but for media in Hong Kong as a whole.
From what I've read, it wasn't just about the paper closing. It was about the message it sent, the chilling effect it had on other media outlets, especially the ones that were critical of the government.
Hmm.
It's like everyone suddenly got a lot more careful about what they published.
Yeah, it's classic self-censorship. When you see something like that happen, a big well-known paper like Apple Daily getting shut down, you start to think twice about what you're reporting, especially when the rules are so blurry under this national security law.
So we've got this incredibly complex case, a media landscape that's been shaken up, worries about freedoms disappearing, and then you throw in the fact that Jimmy Lai was a huge supporter of Donald Trump. What's that about? How does that fit into everything?
That's where things get even more interesting. Lai saw Trump as someone who would stand up for the values he believed in: freedom, democracy, being tough on China. He wasn't just like a casual fan. He met with U.S. politicians, including Mike Pence, to talk about what was happening in Hong Kong.
Yeah, I remember reading about those meetings. Things got pretty heated back then. Some people were accusing Lai of trying to get foreign countries involved in Hong Kong's affairs.
It was definitely seen as a risky move. And then there's that whole story about Trump promising to free Lai if he got reelected. That created a lot of buzz, a lot of speculation, both in Hong Kong and internationally.
Wow. So Lai supporting Trump just adds another layer to this whole thing. It's already this web of international relations and politics, and now we're adding this whole other dimension. What a story. We'll definitely have to dig into that international angle more. And we'll talk more about Apple Daily closing down when we come back after a quick break.
It's wild, right? It's like all these huge global forces are colliding in this one story. You've got the crackdown in Hong Kong, the whole China West thing, and then bam, there's the Trump connection. It's a lot to keep track of.
And speaking of global stuff, you said earlier that people around the world are paying attention to Lai's case. What's the reaction been like? Have other countries said anything?
It's been a mix, really. A lot of condemnation, especially from Western countries, and a lot of calls for Lay to be released. The UK, for instance, they've been pretty outspoken about it.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense. Lai's got a British passport, right? So that adds another layer to it. Has the UK government actually done anything concrete, like taken any action?
Oh, yeah, they have. The UK Prime Minister actually brought it up directly with Xi Jinping at that G20 summit in Brazil recently. They see Lai's detention and this whole trial as a human rights violation, basically. And they're saying it goes against the Sino-British Joint Declaration. That's the agreement that was supposed to guarantee Hong Kong certain freedoms after the handover, remember?
So it's not just about one guy for them. They see it as a much bigger issue, like an international agreement being broken.
Right. And it's not just the UK. The US has also been pretty critical of the national security law and everything that's been happening in Hong Kong in terms of freedoms. They're pointing to Lai's case as a prime example of how Beijing is using this law to silence people.
So there's this growing pressure on China from the international community. What's China's response to all this? Are they listening?
Not really. They're pushing back hard. They're accusing foreign governments of meddling in their business, saying the national security law is necessary to keep things stable in Hong Kong.
It's like they're saying, back off, this is our territory, we'll handle it how we see fit.
Exactly. They've been especially harsh towards the U.S., accusing them of using Lai's case to try to, limit China's power on the world stage.
So this case has blown up way beyond just a courtroom in Hong Kong.
Mm.
It's become this focal point in the whole power struggle between China and the West.
It has. And it puts Western governments in a really tough spot. They want to stick to their principles, support human rights, but they also have to deal with China, which is a huge player on the world stage, both economically and politically. It's a delicate balancing act.
Yeah, it's like they're trying to walk this tightrope between sticking to their values and not rocking the boat too much with China. But let's bring it back to Lai for a second. What does all this mean for him? What are the possible outcomes of this trial?
The stakes are incredibly high. If he's found guilty, he could be looking at spending the rest of his life behind bars. And even if he's acquitted, his life has already changed drastically. I mean, he was in jail for almost 4 years waiting for this trial. His newspaper was shut down, and his reputation, at least in Beijing's eyes, is pretty much shot.
It's a stark reminder that these big political battles have real human consequences. People's lives are on the line.
Absolutely. And it's not just about Lai himself. His case sends a message to other pro-democracy activists, journalists, anyone in Hong Kong who might speak out. It makes them think twice, knowing that they could end up in the same situation.
It's a warning, basically, like, don't even think about crossing the line, or this is what could happen to you.
That's a good way to put it. And that was the whole point of the national security law in the first place, to create this atmosphere of fear, where people censor themselves because they're too scared to speak out.
So this trial, it's about way more than just one man's freedom. It's about the whole future of Hong Kong, what free speech even means there. And it's about how we balance security and liberty in a world that's increasingly complex. It's heavy stuff.
It is. And the outcome of this trial could have huge ripple effects, not just in Hong Kong, but for how China and the West interact with each other going forward.
It's a pivotal moment, that's for sure. It feels like all these different threads are converging right now. Before we wrap up, I want to circle back to Apple Daily, Lai's newspaper that was shut down. Can you tell us more about why this event was so significant? How does it fit into the bigger picture?
The closure of Apple Daily was a turning point for Hong Kong, no doubt about it. This wasn't just any newspaper. It was a symbol of independent media, a voice that people trusted.
And it was hugely popular, right?
Yeah.
Like, a lot of people in Hong Kong read it, especially those who weren't happy with the government.
That's right. It was known for its bold reporting, sometimes even provocative. They weren't afraid to take on powerful people, and they were definitely on the side of democracy. When it shut down, it left a huge hole in Hong Kong's media landscape.
So how did it actually happen? What were the specific steps the authorities took to shut down such a big, influential newspaper so they went after Apple Daily? We talked about how the authorities used the national security law to target it, but how did they actually shut it down? What were the tactics they used against such a big, popular newspaper?
It was a pretty well-coordinated attack, really. A multi-pronged approach, you could say. First, they froze all of the company's assets. That meant they couldn't pay their staff, couldn't cover any of their operating costs. Then they went after the people in charge. They arrested a bunch of the top executives, including Jimmy Lai himself. And to top it all off, they raided the newspaper's offices, taking all sorts of documents and equipment.
Wow. It sounds like they were making an example out of Apple Daily, sending a message to anyone else who might step out of line.
Oh, absolutely. It was a clear signal that dissent wouldn't be tolerated anymore, not even from a big, well-established outlet like Apple Daily.
So the paper's gone, and you said journalists are being a lot more careful now. But what does this mean for Hong Kong in the long run? What are the lasting consequences of Apple Daily closing down?
Well, the most obvious consequence is that Hong Kong has lost a really important source of independent news and opinion. Apple Daily was known for its investigative journalism, for holding powerful people accountable. That kind of scrutiny is crucial for a healthy democracy. Without it, things can get pretty murky.
It's like losing a watchdog, right? The one who's supposed to bark when something's wrong.
Exactly. And it's not just about losing one newspaper. The whole media landscape in Hong Kong has been affected. Journalists are afraid, and who can blame them? They don't want to end up like the folks at Apple Daily, so they're thinking twice about what they write.
So it's not just self-censorship. It's also about avoiding certain topics altogether, right? Like anything that could be seen as sensitive or critical of the government.
That's right. And that means the people of Hong Kong are getting less information, fewer perspectives. It's a real loss for everyone.
It's a pretty bleak picture. Can Hong Kong really thrive? Can it stay a global hub if freedom of the press is gone?
That's the million-dollar question. Hong Kong's always been known for its openness, its rule of law, and its free flow of information. If those things disappear, well, it could have a huge impact on the city's economy, its standing in the world, even its identity.
It's like we're watching an experiment unfold in real time. Can a system that values control over freedom actually succeed? It's a tough question.
It is. And whatever happens in Hong Kong will have consequences that reach far beyond the city itself. The whole world is watching.
Well, this has been quite the deep dive. We started with the story of one man, Jimmy Lai, and ended up talking about freedom, democracy, the role of the media. It's clear that Lai's case is just one small part of a much bigger story that's still being written.
Definitely. And it's a story that reminds us all how important it is to defend those basic freedoms, not just in Hong Kong, but everywhere.
Thank you so much for joining us for this deep dive. It's been eye-opening, to say the least. I know I've learned a lot, and I hope our listeners have too.
It's been my pleasure. These are complex issues, but it's crucial that we keep learning about them, keep asking questions, and keep the conversation going.
We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a new topic. Until then, keep exploring, keep those brains working, and we'll see you next time.
I have long determined not to be frightened by fear.